All right, good. Welcome everyone to the CoinRock show. Today we have a very special guest here. We have Roger Wang, who will be joining us to talk specifically about Bitcoin. And as always, I'll start by talking about and reading Roger's bio, and then Roger will go over his own story because there's only so much we can say in a few lines, but then we'll go. I have a lot of questions here about Roger's just career and things in general. So this is the official bio. First of all, welcome to the show, Roger.
Thanks for having me.
Roger is one of the first writers to discuss the intersection of Bitcoin, remittance payments, and drug policy in 2014, as featured in VentureBeat and TechCrunch. Roger covers Bitcoin in various stories where it intersects with geopolitics, economics, and history, having explored topics such as the digital yuan, internet censorship, the relationship between Bitcoin and dissidents, and the adoption of Bitcoin by businesses and governments. He's been a hodler of Ethereum and Bitcoin and has built several projects with them. He's the author of a book on Bitcoin plus China, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin, available on Amazon. We'll link everything, of course, around the video. And you can find him on Nostra, and we'll link that to also. You can find him on X, Roger H 1991, and ChinaBitcoinBook.com. Welcome to the show, Roger. There's a
Thanks
lot
for
to
having
explore.
me. Yeah.
Nice. So, based on the bio here, what do you want to add? What do you want to get into first?
Sure, I can share a little bit about my story. So the first thing is the bios from my Forbes contributorship. So I've been writing really about the industry and Bitcoin for a pretty long time, I guess you can say, since 2014. And I want to say that I grew up in Montreal, and I studied economics. And the reason why I got into Bitcoin in the first place was because of this disillusionment with the system and this idea of printing money to solve all these different problems. And since then I've done numerous things. One has been writing.
Yep.
So I've written a book. I've also worked in kind of like a growth marketing capacity, and then recently have started consulting for Bitcoin companies such as Block Rewards, which does Bitcoin payroll. And I've been a pretty active member of the Bitcoin community in Vancouver and in other places, and have been kind of speaking in conferences around the world since last year because of the book, really.
Yep.
So yeah, those are like a few things, but happy to answer any questions.
Nice. So let's talk about the book because that's really what you've been, I'd say the most recent work. And I've written several books too. I know the effort and the thinking that needs to go into writing a book. So why the book? What did you come up with, with a subject matter? What did you want to accomplish? And what's the big idea or the big ideas of the book?
Yeah, sure. No, happy to talk about it a little bit more. Got a little copy over here, so
Nice.
putting that up as well. Um, so I've actually been also writing about China and China related issues. I was born in China, and I used to go back and forth every year. Now less
Yep.
so, but previous in the past. And I've always kind of, even though I consider myself a member of the Chinese diaspora, I've always kind of maintained a connection to Chinese culture, Chinese history, and the Chinese language. And so the book was really my attempt to dive deeper, because I thought I was one of the only people. I started writing about the Chinese digital yuan, which is their version of a
Yep.
CBDC, a central bank digital currency issued by the central bank. And I was one of the first writers there, and that wasn't necessarily because I was fast or rapidly kind of looking at these things. It was because I was one of the only people at the time who was
Yeah.
really looking at these things. And so I thought I had a really unique opportunity to do some research. I was in Hong Kong, for example, like even during the protests and stuff, and just trying to figure out what was going on with the Bitcoin community there and the Bitcoin scene. Um, and also really try to understand what I thought was like a really fascinating interplay. So you asked for like the central idea of the book, and the central idea of the book ended up being, um, that it wasn't as clean of a narrative as I thought it was. It wasn't this idea that like Bitcoin was hedging against political force, and was eroding the authoritarianism of the CCP. Let's just say as an example, right?
Yep.
That's like a
Yep.
very simple black and white narrative. But what I realized is that people were using it despite all the restrictions.
Mm.
And so really the central idea became this idea that different countries will take different approaches, but so long as Bitcoin remains a censorship-proof, a monetary network with a lot of
Yep.
balance between these different stakeholders and powers, such as miners and community members, it'll be very hard, if not impossible, for any country to ban it or to restrict it. That also applies to cryptocurrencies in general, but mostly on Bitcoin. But you can see, for example, in Hong Kong, the beginning of like them giving up this wave of restrictions. And so
Yep.
that kind of became the central thesis of the book. And yeah, it took 2 years of research. You've written a lot of books, so I think as fellow writers, we can kind of relate on that. So it was a lot of content, and I had to pare down a lot of stuff.
Yep.
And I'm already actually working on a second book, but a lot of lessons learned from the first one.
Nice. How is China with crypto today? Like, what does the West not understand, and what do Europeans and Americans misunderstand of how crypto works and is perceived by people, but also how is it perceived and used by the government in China?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I fashion myself as more of a Bitcoin writer, but of course, as a researcher,
Yep.
you always kind of accept what is happening, or you're trying to observe what's going on. You're not trying to editorialize too much. Um, so I think what's been really interesting is the thing I think Western people don't necessarily get is how wild or raucous the Chinese internet is and how hard it is to keep
Hmm.
control of it. I think you have this image of like a sterile internet.
Yep.
And what's interesting about that is I see the same amount of censorship happening in some degrees in both, let's say, the quote unquote Western internet and the Chinese internet. And it's a different
Yep.
direction. So I think most people think of the Chinese internet as like Orwellian. They think it's like,
Yep.
oh, it's like directly controlled. And there are elements of this, don't get me wrong. Like people do get arrested for saying things and, at a surprisingly
Yep.
low amount of impact, you would think, you know.
Yep.
So that does definitely happen. But actually, the way the Chinese government architects the internet is very similar to how governments in the West do it. And it's kind of this Brave New World thing where there's so much like content designed to get you to just buy random crap.
Yep.
And really, it's China where that was kind of mastered. So what you see in the Western internet these days is actually like kind of offshoots from the Chinese internet.
Yep.
So to give you an example, TikTok, obviously coming in from Douyin, and I think that in China there's like this huge like live streaming community where you're seeing like e-commerce
Yep.
happening and people are streaming that, and the Western internet is kind of like evolving in that direction, right? So it's becoming this
Yep.
big magnet of not necessarily discussion, but of like commerce. Um,
Yeah, I saw the numbers some of these live streaming social media infomercials are pulling. I mean,
yeah,
not the West can never do like is not doing those numbers at all when it comes to infomercials.
it's not doing those numbers, but like, that's kind of like the direction the censorship is. It's less like
Hmm.
it's much less like, hey, we're gonna go directly into your devices, and sometimes that does happen. Again, I have some
Yep.
anecdotes of people getting reached out to, whether they're using money a certain way, or whether they're using the WeChat Pay a certain way. Like, so I don't want to underrate that, but I want to
Yep.
say the main thrust of it is that you actually distract people, and
Hmm.
that's being
Yep.
accomplished across both internets. The reason why I'm doing this up is because on the face of it, you might think that the Chinese government has banned crypto and
Yep.
Bitcoin, so therefore no Chinese person will use it. And that's not uh, true. And you have to understand this like kind of raucous nature. Like for example, VPNs in China are
Yep.
technically illegal, though the restrictions kind of more like regulated like weed companies.
Yep. Yep.
The idea is that like, I mean, if you're like an average smoker, they can't really like arrest everybody who smokes weed.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if you're like selling
A
weed en
supplier.
masse,
Yeah.
you know, a supplier, they might try to go after you. But even then, I've been hearing from some friends like, there's the VPN companies are running ads in Guangzhou and stuff, so
Yep.
you're still kind of around. But the general idea is that like you're not supposed to use a VPN yet. Chinese people massively use VPNs, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
from quantitative, qualitative, and they do often what's called flipping the Great Firewall or flipping over the wall. So I don't know how
Yeah.
familiar your listeners are, but just a quick primer. China has a Great Firewall, and essentially what that means is that if you're within China, you can't really readily access stuff from the Western internet, right?
Yep.
So, for example, like Facebook or any of the social media apps or Google or a lot of sites, and that's actually that control has been tightened.
Yep.
Like for example, recently the Chinese government has actually banned LinkedIn and like Microsoft property, so
Yep.
they've gotten pretty aggressive about stopping or censoring certain technical networks and platforms and apps and things like that, right? But most Chinese people will, even though it's kind of restricted, they will use VPNs, and that way they can show their IP address as being outside of China and they can have access to all this content. And so
Yep.
that's why, for example, if you go on X, for example, you are actually able to interface with the Chinese crypto community. Um, or
Very active community too. Like
Yeah,
extremely
extremely
active.
active,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
extremely
Yeah. Yeah.
active. And so, like, if you don't understand these things, then you would almost from first principles just be like, "Oh, how is this all happening?" But
Mm,
that also feeds into, I mean, originally it started with with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin
yep.
is still the largest brand in China. But I also want to say that now a lot of the trade involves stable coins, Tether,
Yep.
and now, you have, of course, in the past, I mean, to varying degrees of success, EOS and ETH have
Yep.
tried to kind of like be inside the Chinese community, and they've been really active about
Yep.
evangelizing it. Um, so what this has led to is actually quite an active community, and you can see
Mm,
that not only qualitatively. Now, the sad thing is that most of the people may not speak English, so it's
yep.
harder to access. Well, they do speak English, but they choose not to speak English even in their gatherings outside of the Great Firewall. So whenever I've been in
Yeah.
kind of these rooms when people are discussing their trading or whatever they're doing. And I have to say, most of the time, it seems to be trading or, DeFi or layer two kind of stuff.
Yep.
Um, they are doing it in Mandarin. Having said that, a lot of them, come from the Beijing, Shanghai tech scene.
Yep.
And so most of them will be able to speak English.
Yep. Yep.
And so there is a lot of that. But it's a very active community, and it's not just, there's also still VCs that are operating. There's
Yep.
devs that work within China. There's entrepreneurs who are building all kinds of different things, whether it's, I was just talking to a couple of entrepreneurs. One is building a Nostr client, another one is building
Mm,
kind of like a layer two kind of thing. So there's a lot of energy around it, actually, and that's something that you probably wouldn't understand if you just were reading the narrative, right? If you were just
yep.
reading the news articles
Yep.
and stuff like that, and you weren't as involved, or I never really considered myself like an insider in the Chinese community. Like even when I was going back and forth between China and the West, like I wasn't
Yep.
really getting involved on the local communities. Like I would almost kind of be more involved in the Western side. But because of the book, I ended up actually meeting quite a few people,
Nice.
researching quite a bit and things like that. And yeah, there's a really, really strong presence. So despite the fact the government hasn't really changed things
Mm,
since 2021,
yep.
I mean, it kind of put down like a layer of different bans. I mean, there was like any number of restrictions. Like, so for example, there was an ICO ban. there was a ban on using exchanges, all those other things. But
Yep.
it's at the point where since there hasn't been like new movement, and if anything, people who have left the government have started saying things like, "Oh, maybe this whole ban on crypto or and Bitcoin are really, really useless or bad
Yep.
things,"
Yep.
right? Like we just ended up giving all this energy to the United States or to other countries
Yep.
because they're kind of looking at what Trump is doing and saying, then that's where you're starting to see that kind of community energy is still growing
Mm.
or constant, and the government hasn't really shifted. And I think a little bit of what you're seeing in Hong Kong, um, because in Hong Kong, for example, there's like a very active, actually, they're trying to regulate a little bit more, but obviously you can buy like spot ETFs.
Yep.
You can, trade. There's also a lot of like over-the-counter shops where you can actually go, and I've had
Yep.
friends who trade large amounts in Lightning in Bitcoin and then get Hong Kong dollars back, right? So that all
Mm.
still exists.
Yep.
Um, and I think you're seeing that because the government is kind of either neutral or, there are some former government officials that are criticizing the Chinese restrictions. And then the community has just been buying and using and trading and everything all along. And that's
Yep.
from the quantitative measures, from like, chain analysis has done some studies, it seems that volume is only going up and up from a quarterly basis.
Yep. What's one thing, or what are the things that Western crypto slash Bitcoin communities don't know about China? Misconceptions, right? There's always this talk about like the Chinese whales. Is Chinese crypto, is that landscape ahead of the West? What's your view if you had to compare both?
Yeah, I have my own personal opinions on this, but certainly the difference is quite stark. I don't know if they're like more advanced or more behind. I mean, I
Mm,
think that um one thing to say is that the a lot of the activity seems to be very trading focused.
yeah,
Um, and one thing that is I think I'll say a differentiator is that the Chinese community, um, I don't know if this is a misconception from Westerners, but I think the Chinese community, you have to keep in mind that they don't really have the choice to be a hybrid necessarily,
yeah, yeah,
right? And what I mean by that is that in the West, right, you can still kind of live your life on fiat and then
yeah,
use Bitcoin whenever you want, right? And then in many ways, there are now these integrations between the two. So you can use like prepaid debit cards, or there's
more
certain
and more actually,
services.
more and more services, especially the last
Yeah,
12, 24 months.
exactly. There's like
Yep,
a lot of services actually where you can actually replicate some traditional banking functions, including like
yep,
lending and all these other things. But those are done through like a centralized intermediary because those services are not restricted, right?
yep,
In China, you don't really have that choice.
mm,
And the banking system is very heavily surveilled.
yep,
So if there's ever, cash flows or anything, you kind of asked this interesting question of like, how are government officials in China using crypto and Bitcoin? And I've heard rumors, I haven't reported on it because I don't have like a firm thing on it, but there
yep,
have been some cases of people getting arrested as local officials for taking Bitcoin as bribes or for running a Bitcoin mining company on the slide. So we know there's some public kind
yep.
of stuff. But I've actually heard to this point, like the monetary system is so tightly controlled now. I'll just give you two quick anecdotes.
You
Like
mean
one time,
to get the money out of China or within?
both, right?
Okay.
And I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, part of the reason why there's so much control is because actually for your listeners, China was always the country, now actually slightly less so because they've loosened it a little bit, but
Mm,
by many measures, academic measures, China was one of the strictest at what was called capital controls.
yeah. Yeah.
And so the marquee thing that most people that I usually communicate with most people is that in order to buy foreign currency, if you exceed a certain amount, you actually have to send a note in to a specific regulator,
Yeah.
and they have to like approve that with your bank, and then the bank can issue you that foreign currency, right? So it's
Yep.
50,000 USD per person per year. I mean, that's like the most famous implication of it. But in
Yep.
general, China makes it difficult. Like once you're so one thing is that the Chinese people, by monetary supply measures, are one of, if not the most banked people on earth. This is
Interesting.
because there's a high savings rate. Structurally, there's always been a high savings rate, and then most of that
Yep.
goes into the domestic banking system. And
Yep.
and in
Yep.
fact, the Chinese system is kind of dependent on that, right? It's dependent on keeping these funds in this kind of ring circle, so then that
Yep.
can
In the country.
go out in the country, yeah, in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
country's
Yeah. Yeah.
financial systems. Um, so the idea is like in China, obviously there's been a lot of changes. To summarize all the changes, in general, you are now allowed to make money, but once you make that money, what you do with the money can be controlled.
Yep.
And most important part is like whether or not you can get it out of the country.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to give you another tangible example of this, like Chinese mainland investors are forbidden from investing in the Bitcoin spot ETFs in Hong Kong.
Interesting. Yeah.
Just to give you an example of another restriction.
Yeah.
Um, so the system of capital controls and the banking restrictions, I mean, they kind of go hand in hand because basically what happens is if you're Chinese and you want to have savings, likely you're going to put your money into a Chinese banking account.
Yep.
But the problem with that is that there's a lot of surveillance. And to give you just two quick stories, like one time I had someone who DM'd someone else about Bitcoin in the mainland, and they were actually banned from suspended from WeChat. And the thing about
What, because of the
China,
keyword, because of that word?
yeah, potentially. I mean, that's what they
Okay.
think.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously, I'm not, I'm trying to be a little bit, there might have been other reasons, but that was the
Sure.
reason that they cited to me.
Yep.
And the thing about that is like WeChat, because the other thing that's happened in China is that WeChat Pay um, is actually everything for you. It's your social
Yeah.
identity, it's your payments solution, it's connected to your bank account.
Yeah.
So WeChat does not, unlike,
Maybe
it
explain to
doesn't.
people who don't know what WeChat is.
Yeah, so WeChat is a basically the social app for everything.
Yeah.
Elon is trying to create something similar with X. He's mentioned it
Yeah.
several times. And the idea is that you log in and it's like your LinkedIn, it's your Facebook, it's your everything. So that's another thing that the Chinese ecosystem is different from the Western is there's a little bit more consolidation. And
Yeah.
specifically with WeChat, payments is much more integrated with your social identity. So you will typically use WeChat Pay as well as having a WeChat account to do like group discussion. So you might
Yeah.
think of like a hybrid of like, if I were to describe it to people in the West, like a hybrid of Venmo or Cash App, except I mean it's a lot more KYC than Cash
Yeah.
App. And then your
And connected to
LinkedIn and
all your
your
socials. Yeah.
yeah, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Telegram, like kind of all in one as well,
Yeah.
right? Because you're able to post photos and all this other stuff.
Hey, Matthias here, and if you're enjoying this and want access to even more alpha, early stage deals and opportunities, and also behind the scenes insights on the markets, hit the link in the description and make sure you're subscribed. It's free and it puts you ahead of the curve. Let's get back to the show.
That's a misconception, which is that the way Western people use Bitcoin is pretty different from the way Chinese people use it because of this implication of like
Yeah.
all the apps are kind of centralized. The banking system is really tightly controlled. And to wrap that all the way back, I've heard of stories of government officials who take bribes in, again, I'm not trying to report on this officially. I need to
Yeah.
get some sourcing, but taking bribes in crypto or in Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And this kind of shows that the monetary control is so tight. I mean, obviously we're pinpointing an example that's being described as bribery,
Yeah.
which is connotated very negatively. But you can think about it in terms of just any financial activity at
Yeah.
all, right, is tightly surveilled and controlled. And so your only alternative is to really like get out of that system. And not
Yeah.
only um, for like even for mundane things like investing in foreign shares or
Yeah.
investing in like
Yeah.
more options, you kind of have to split off from the network. So I think that's the one thing is that Chinese users, I mean, they tend to use exchanges and they tend to be trading because
Yep.
they're outside looking for a return. They're looking for financial return
Mm.
outside of the Chinese system. But the other thing that I think is important to perceive is that they require infrastructure that's kind of separated from the Chinese banking system. And what I
Yep.
mean by that is that like once they get in from one world and out to another world, and traditionally the way it works is like they'll buy tether from
Mm.
peers or things like that, right? So once they made that leap, they want to keep those funds. Like there's
Yep.
not really like a banking and Chinese banking and because that's illegal basically,
Yep. Yep.
and exchanges thing. So once you have that tether, it's like what you're gonna do with it is completely separate, and you can't have like intermediaries really work with you, right? So that means all these different products like debit cards or credit
Yep.
cards or lending or all these other things like they pretty much have to be provided. This is why I think there's more. This is my personal hypothesis and why there's more energy on like L2 and like kind of more DeFi kind of applications
Yep.
because people in China are kind of taking their savings and porting it to a whole new system. And
Yep.
they don't really have the option of a bridge, right? So yeah, the other I mean, I would say the misconception is that like that comes from an area of like pure greed rather than understanding the mechanics of like what it means to get into Bitcoin or crypto if you're in a China, right?
Mm.
And I would say that another thing I'll say is that I think that those people who are buying it are very underrepresented in like the public discourse, like in the shows
Yep.
that we have and things like that. And that's partially because, like as I mentioned, as they're discussing this, they mostly talk with each other in Mandarin, or they have their own
Yep.
groups or communities. And so you have like all these people who are using Tether, Bitcoin, they're trading in alts,
Yep.
but there's not necessarily a lot of understanding of what's going on or their perception. There are a
Yep.
couple reporters, there's Colin Wu, Wu Blockchain. He's kind of a little bit more general
Yep.
crypto. I usually just write about Bitcoin or only write about Bitcoin, but he writes a little bit more about the general scene. And so there are people you can follow who do translate into English. Wolfie has the Miner Mag, which has a lot of mining news, and
Yep.
that's still a lot of the Bitcoin miners and a lot of the crypto miners, were Chinese in origin. The companies are Chinese.
Yep.
Um, actually, I was talking with a friend, and he had a fascinating thought where he was like, maybe the rise of AI came about because China banned Ethereum mining as well
Interesting.
as Bitcoin
Yep.
mining. Because if you remember Jihan, who created Bitmain, so Bitmain is kind of the company that creates all the Bitcoin mining chips,
Yep. Yep.
the ASICs that are used to, I'm assuming your readers are kind of familiar with this, but the general idea is like specialized computer chips that are
Yep.
better at mining.
Mining.
Yeah. And he actually, when all the mining ban stuff was happening, started shifting to investing in AI pretty early
Mm.
on,
Okay.
pretty early on. Because if you think about all these chips, right, that they're building, they have the ability. I mean, they're different in the sense of like mining chips are specifically built for one purpose
Yep.
only, but the infrastructure and the thinking are very similar. So, anyways, an interesting thought because definitely some of the people in this community started investing in
AI.
AI and
Yep.
ML related different things like pretty early on, like earlier than when it hit like kind of critical mass. And some of those investments ended up going into like OpenAI like before
Yep.
OpenAI hit critical mass. So there's a lot of like interesting stories about that. I mean, one thing I'll end off on, I know I've been kind of going off on different angles, but a lot of the history of Bitcoin and other alts is really based in China in a way that's like kind of might be surprising to some people. And some of that is just because some of the big whales have come
Yep.
there, like what you
Yep.
mentioned, like one of the original OG whales. Like we recently had that movement at 80,000 Bitcoin, and people were speculating it was this Chinese
Yep.
whale that bought really early on. A lot of the whales are, I think, in China, not only they're reasonably active as well, some of them. They're running like OTC desks and things like that. Like Jihan's running Matrix Port and like a whole bunch of other things and
Yep.
still running, OTC exchanges and trades. And obviously he lost in the whole Bitcoin Cash war and everything like that. But he was still involved, and he kind of applied some of those funds to invest in AI, as we discussed. But you have like even places like FTX and other places, like they got some of their initial funding and
Yep.
founding
Yep.
through Hong Kong OTC shops. And if you
Yep.
think about Tether, actually, Paulo started that in Hong Kong.
Yep.
And really, it spread in China because Bitfinex had all these like key opinion leaders, which are kind of like influencers back in the day. So
Yep.
there's a lot of history. So it's not just that like Chinese people are kind of passively using it or, thinking about it. There, a lot of the great companies, I mean, of course, Binance, and
Yep.
others,
The
they
majority
came from
of the
China.
majority of all centralized exchanges now are China born, or at least China initiated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So especially, well, if you think about Binance,
Yep.
Huobi, OKX, but even if they're not China based, like the Binance model really spawned like a
Yep.
million, different things. And that
Yep.
was born out of
Bybits.
the,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, Bybit as well. And that was like, that was born out of a war in China where all the exchanges were trying to be competitive with each other, right? So then
Yep.
CZ actually used to work in the Chinese crypto scene. He was I think he was CTO of, I have to fact check myself because it's in the book, but I think he was CTO of OKX before he
Interesting.
founded Binance.
Binance.
But the whole
Yep.
point is that, and I know I actually talked in the book with Bobby Lee, who founded BTCC, or
Yep.
co-founded BTCC, which was China's kind of first Bitcoin exchange. I mean, the fundamental thing was that you had all the miners, you have all these OGs, and we might never know all of them, right? Like who they are, where they are.
Yep.
Like it's probably, if my guess is, I tried to reach out in the book, but obviously they're very confidential people. It's kind of hard to
Yep.
reach out to them, and they don't really have any incentive to talk about, what they're doing or what they've
Yep.
done. But my suspicion is that a lot of the OGs, they still have their Bitcoin and they just have it in steel plates, or they've
Yep.
moved around, or maybe they're kind of geographically based. Like the people who are publicly known, there some of them are outside of mainland China. Like Jihan's in
Yep. Yep.
Singapore, CZ's obviously been running around the world for a while,
Yep.
but they basically the OGs spawned this industry. And Mt. Gox at the time, the problem was they did not accept CNY. They did not accept Chinese yuan.
Interesting. Yep.
And so then you had most of the Bitcoin, because most of the physical hash rate was in China at the time,
Yep.
right? And so all this Bitcoin, when Bitcoin was going from child to adult, when it was becoming a teenager, it was really happening in China.
Mm.
And so then you had the exchanges infrastructure and the mining pool infrastructure, because
Yep.
you had all the physical hash rate, because all the computing chips, and then China also had all the electricity.
Yep.
And then the exchanges were kind of competing with one another. In that sense, China was, I guess you could say, more advanced, because that's kind of like where
Then the
you see
West. Oh
stuff
yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that's where you
Yeah.
see stuff like Binance, and Binance was kind of the first to really pioneer like more aggressive like options trading, like more
Yeah. Yep.
options. And that was partially as a response to being competitive in this Chinese field where there were a lot of exchanges
Yep.
servicing different clients. And then to order to differentiate, because CZ had already worked for one, right? Like the idea was like, okay, well, let's be as aggressive as possible and offer as many options as possible once people put
Yep.
their crypto in with us. And I think part of that, as that kept on evolving, um, continued because the Chinese government was continuing to put restrictions. As early
Yep.
as 2013, they basically said that no Chinese banking uh, service should be interacting with Bitcoin,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
right? So you already had this kind of split. So then, that's kind of where I think, at least my theory and hypothesis is, that's where like people in Binance, uh, where Binance really started to build out all these options of like, okay, well, once you have your funds with us, here
Yep.
are all the numerous things you can do.
You could do
And
on
that's
the
where kind of,
platform. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, you can
Yeah.
do on the platform, right? Because
Yep.
we kind of have to like replicate things that you have to do, like you could have done in the conventional system
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
that you were
yeah,
like restricted to doing. So that's where I think the Chinese system is like a little bit more advanced. Like I don't really know if that's completely the case now. It feels like it's kind of still the same, but I will say that like I feel like stable coin usage and other things like Chinese people are like actually the ones using these things.
yeah,
And they're demanding payment in them. I was talking with someone who is based more in Africa and has been writing about how Chinese exporters now really prefer, or has told me, that Chinese exporters to African
yeah.
importers will now prefer payment in USDT
Interesting.
because
Yeah, 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 yeah.
because yeah, and the reason why is because they're avoiding this Chinese system of control and surveillance
Capital
from the
controls.
beginning.
Yeah,
Yeah, because they don't want their money to be, you give it to me in
yeah,
Chinese yuan, and then I'm restricted in what I can do with it. I'm
yeah,
restricted in
yeah,
what I
yeah,
can invest. And then if I'm in USDT, now there's this like parallel infrastructure,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So I think there are, I would guess that all the stablecoin motion, at least from an entrepreneurial standpoint, like the people actually using it and demanding services in it and demanding like more functionality for their USDT, and the ones who are feeding kind of like these over-the-counter exchanges, which is kind
yeah.
of
The
like these
actual
private
usage. Oh
banks.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the actual usage is probably mostly China or Chinese
Interesting.
people.
Yeah,
And I've seen some Chinese entrepreneurs who are trying to build out stuff related to that. And even
yeah,
with, Tether, the way it works is very interesting, right? Because it doesn't, it's chain agnostic.
yeah,
It works with Tron, and Tron is obviously Justin's son and everything, who has been benefiting from kind of subsidizing that chain. But even in what Tether is trying to do with like Lightning, as trying to be an
yeah,
issuer and taproot assets and work, and you can work with ETH and all these other things. I think like what you can do once you have Tether, that's like where I think there's quite a few Chinese entrepreneurs. First on the exchanges level, right? Like,
yeah,
so what's been happening in China is like you have these exchanges that, I mean, in my opinion, it's kind of like, I don't think it's great, but they are in practice basically being more aggressive at listing trading pairs.
yep,
So you can trade like tokens, honestly, that I've never heard of in my life. But if you think of the full gamut of tradable tokens, I mean, most international people are going to struggle to get that full comprehensive kind of coverage, I guess you could say.
yeah. You mean
But in
like
a
when
lot
new
of these
pairs, new
projects,
new memes popping up?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And a
Yeah,
lot of these projects, again, my personal opinion, I think they're all kind of like a waste of time and effort. It's
yeah,
my personal opinion. But my point with that is that, the coverage is more comprehensive because the Chinese ecosystem, the entrepreneurs are competing with one another, right? So even the
interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
exchanges
yeah,
that are servicing Chinese people, and they know they're servicing Chinese people, and they're more like
yeah,
China based, they need to kind of, I think some of them are complying with like the Chinese authorities in a certain way, but they need to be innovative with like the options that are offered once you
yeah,
have either Tether or Bitcoin. And what that looks like for at least some of the exchanges is offering more and more trading pairs.
yeah,
But what that also looks like is Chinese entrepreneurs who are trying to figure out like once you have Tether, right, can we replicate or can we build out, how you can use that? Can you secure loans with it?
yeah,
Right? Can you secure access to US banking with it? So I've heard of some Chinese entrepreneurs who are working on different solutions for all these problem sets. Because the thing is, like, Chinese people are actually not like LARPing or cosplaying. Like, they are using this and
yeah, yeah,
trading
yeah,
it
yeah,
with
yeah,
each
yeah,
other en
yeah,
masse. And, they're trading it at margin. So they're the ones who are buying and they're buying and selling. And so,
yeah,
a lot of these services, I think actual stablecoin usage, like to the extent that there's like entrepreneurs servicing that, like I think that's going to come mostly from China because that's where, these are actually being used.
yeah,
And then the trading pairs, I think there's a lot of availability. And what I've noticed is that kind of earlier when we were talking about the Chinese internet being like very streaming heavy,
yeah, yeah,
like I feel like the Chinese crypto community acts in a way that's like very different from even us in the West.
yeah,
Like for example, you obviously, Taste, you have the CoinRock show,
Yep.
and that is streamed live usually. We're pre-recording this now because
Yep. Yep.
technical snafus. But that's not actually usually the default, right? Even a lot of people who do podcasts and things like that, it's usually pre-recorded.
Yep.
But what I've found is that, the Chinese crypto community, um, there are some Bitcoin maxis in that, and I love that, by the way, just personally. But just in general, the Chinese crypto community, they have that streaming mentality. So when they come on X
Mm.
and things like that, they'll actually like broadcast their trades. They'll ask each other for technical analysis. They'll ask each
Yep.
other for like token kind of things. And so they're bringing that even into, X or, in Telegram groups or WeChat groups and things like that. Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, that's kind of, I think like hopefully that clears up some misconceptions that Western
Yeah, no,
people
no.
would
This
have
is
about,
this is a lot of
yeah.
alpha, especially for people who only see one side, right? Especially only see the Western side. Yeah, I have two questions. So about 5, 10 minutes left for the show.
Yeah.
One is you're a hodler of ETH and Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So what's your view on ETH? How do you see it in the future? Of course, we know Bitcoin because we talked a lot about it. How do you see it as an asset, and how do you see it um, interacting with Bitcoin, where it's going from now?
Yeah, in complete honesty, I'm like very bearish on it.
Yep.
So that's kind of something that when I got in, so one thing I should mention about my story is in 2014, when I started writing about Bitcoin, I
Yep.
never really got involved economically. And I was very poor at the time. I was a student and a graduate. By the
Yep.
time I got a job and had savings, like ETH was the hot new thing. And I was
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
in
Oh yeah.
SF
Yeah.
and going back and forth between SF and China.
Yep.
So I still do hold ETH. I mean, in Forbes, they have us list everything that we have. So I
Yep.
do only hold those two. Um, ETH personally, I've kind of ridden all the waves. I got a little bearish on it because I started writing about some of the ICO projects. I don't know
Yep.
if this has changed a lot. I mean, you might have a better view on this because I don't really look at this
When
lens
was
anymore.
this?
But this was like in 2018,
Okay.
2019,
Yeah.
that kind of like
Yeah.
during that heyday.
Yeah.
And I was
Yeah.
interviewing a lot of the ICO projects, and they just didn't seem very sound. Or some
Mm.
people would be
Yeah.
like, "Hey, I'm running a web dev shop, so let me just kind of throw that in there." I know that to counter myself a little bit, just to feel like a little bit of balance. Like I know there's a lot of movement in ETH
Sure.
to replicate some of the stuff in Bitcoin.
Yep.
I myself am pretty bearish, and I'm trying to trade as much of my ETH into Bitcoin as possible. That's my personal stance.
Yep.
But I also, I think that if it wasn't for the capital gain structure, I'd have probably done that a little bit faster.
Yep.
So anyways, that's my take. That's my take. It's not particularly well informed though, because I haven't necessarily caught up with the ETH community as much. I used to be a little bit more, caught up in that vein, but less so. And just for something to think about is like I do think ETH uh some of this is a function of like Bitcoin doesn't have like an official marketing department, and that's why some of it's kind of beautiful. It's kind of all people kind of
Yep.
going through it. But I will say that EOS and ETH really punched above their weight when it came to capturing the Chinese kind of developer
Mm.
ecosystem as well as buyer ecosystem.
Yep.
And so even to this day, a lot of the large ETH investors in China are still out and about, and they are,
Yep.
active in trading and all those other things. So that's something to just like consider in terms of alpha.
Yep. In terms of Bitcoin, you mentioned working with Bitcoin Treasury, like around the Bitcoin Treasury strategy, right? Or advising.
Bitcoin payroll. I
Bitcoin
do
payroll. Yeah. Yeah.
growth for like a Bitcoin payroll company, but it does involve talking with a lot of Bitcoin treasury companies, but not
What?
necessarily. Our main theory right now, I mean, my whole stance. Well, let me actually finish. Like, let me let you finish
Sure.
your question if you had one. Yeah.
No, I'm curious to hear what your take is on seeing all these dozens, now hundreds of companies
Yeah.
using the MicroStrategy playbook successfully. Some of them really going like all in, looking
Yeah.
meta plan, for example. What's your take on? So, what's your personal opinion, and also where do you see it going and growing?
Yeah, Bitcoin treasury companies, I think, are the new ICOs. No, I'm
Yeah,
kidding. That was that was
I agree. Yeah,
um, but here, listen, like I think my personal take is that Bitcoin, if you are a Bitcoin treasury company solely for the purpose of being a Bitcoin treasury company, like namely, like you are doing that, and that is like 98% of your business is just
yeah,
buying and holding Bitcoin. I think there's going to be less uh like alpha in that. Like the more
yeah,
and more like, this goes on. I think Metaplanet, and there's maybe a couple of other countries. I was talking to someone about how like Brazil, I think there's someone's trying to do a Metaplanet clone. There's
yeah.
some countries
There's a few.
where,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah, there's a few countries where like the capital structure just like makes so much more sense to be a
yeah,
treasury company. And namely that's because the spread between capital gains on shares
yeah,
and capital gains on, I mean, that's basically what these companies are playing on, essentially,
yeah,
if you boil it all the way down, and also their ability to issue debt. Um, I think that you're gonna see like one or two kind of like obvious leaders in each jurisdiction where that's the case. And
yeah,
Metaplanet probably has already taken that for Japan. I don't know if there's anyone trying to do another Metaplanet.
yeah,
With strategy, I think strategy is the first and probably the most, legitimate at this point, especially with
yeah,
their ability to be, because the other thing is like their ability to raise debt is more sustainable, is based
yeah.
off of like just a longer form history, right? And I don't know how many more of those plays you can have. I mean, it feels, I said they were the new ICO, but actually they're probably the new SPAC. But the thing with the SPACs,
They're hybrid. That's how I see them too. Like
yeah,
SPACs, I think were very short-lived in a way, right? Remember that 2021 phase? I
yeah,
agree. It's there's somewhere between the ICOs. I think we'll see less of them, and I agree with you. They'll be less efficient, right? I mean, I think
yeah,
the 2000th Bitcoin treasury company coming in with 99% of its activity doing, just buying
yeah,
Bitcoin will be less effective than one launching like 6 months ago. But
yeah.
yeah, I think it's a sort of SPAC meets ICO. I agree with that.
Yeah, I'm being a little bit flippant because SPACs, like, obviously the companies were doing something different from each
Something. Yeah,
other.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. It is really interesting to think about because it's hard to categorize because all these companies are kind of but the important thing I think is there's also two types of treasury companies,
yeah,
and that's where it starts getting a little interesting. So we talked about more of the first type, which is like if your primary activity is really just holding Bitcoin on your
yeah,
balance sheet. That I think, to the extent that there's companies trading above their MNAV, like the ratio
yeah,
there, uh, that I think that will start to disappear and erode.
yeah,
I think so. But there are and as I'm working with Bitcoin payroll company, there are companies that are their main line of business is still their main line of business.
yeah,
Like they're still good at doing whatever they're good at doing. So
yeah,
you can think of like a dentist office, or like I've talked with a few companies like a car dealership or someone who does like a phone dealership. Like basically, if you are holding a bunch of reserves in cash right now,
yeah,
and I would point out like Tesla, for example, is holding I think 36 billion in cash.
yeah,
I don't know how much like Apple is, and obviously the thing with cash is like, a lot of these companies are maybe trying to recycle in securities or treasuries just short
yeah,
term, but they have like a limited amount of bandwidth to be able to do that. So there's these companies that have, and you can have cash on your balance sheet. And I think if you're like a low growth, high cash flow company, like we discussed a
yeah,
couple of, like auto dealerships, dentists or things like that. I think you're going to see more and more of these businesses adopt a Bitcoin treasury of
yeah,
sorts, and they're not putting their whole, and it's not their main line of business, and they're not trying to raise funds because they're doing it. But the idea is that they're going to hold more and more in treasury.
yeah,
So let's say I've talked with some, like, there's a small business that I know that's like holding like 10% or like 20%,
yep,
and they're
yep,
holding their balance sheet. And the whole idea is that like, obviously cash, um, you're fighting a losing game. You're
yeah,
losing like maybe, anywhere between 7 to 15, depends on if you believe the official
Yeah.
inflation stats or not, but like anywhere between 7 to 15% of your value. So
Yeah.
and the opportunity cost, right? Because you could be making, 5 or the with Bitcoin, I mean, if it follows the same annualized return as it has in the last few years, I
Yep.
mean, obviously not always a given, right? You're looking at, outsized
Yeah.
preservation
At
of
least preservation.
wealth.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
at
Yeah.
least preservation, if not,
Yeah.
actually like growth and extension. And I
Yeah.
think that there are more and more business owners that are kind of realizing this, and
Yeah.
that's where you're seeing, like, my guess is that's actually where that's like the long tail, because
Yeah.
this has been a very weird bull market where I
Yeah.
don't quite think retail from a lot of different measures is quite there yet,
Yep. I
right?
agree. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So it's like who is actually buying, right?
Yeah.
So there's a question of who is selling, and it seems like that's also an interesting thing because, again, to our
Yeah.
earlier point of like, we don't know what the whales are doing. It does seem like it's like the OGs that
Yeah.
are selling, to a certain degree. And then the question is who's buying. And then obviously you have all these public companies that are running around and saying like,
Institutions. Yep. Yep.
institutions,
Raising and buying. Yep.
yeah. So you have like Strategy, for example, who's always
Yep.
publicly buying. But I think a hidden long tail, which I think explains some of the difference, because also these buyers tend to work with OTCs instead of
Yep.
working with exchanges,
Yep.
is companies.
Yes.
So I talked with someone who is at an exchange, and they were telling me like, look, like we've got people. I'm not going to name names because I think it was
Yep.
kind of given to me in confidence, but in general, they were saying like, hey, like we have people who have bought onto their balance sheet that haven't announced, and they're like public companies.
Yep.
And
Yep.
we have like thousands and thousands of companies. Like you wouldn't expect it,
Yep.
but they have some amount of Bitcoin
Yep.
on their balance sheet. And I think there's like this long tail of institutional adoption, but it's from the second type of Bitcoin treasury company
Yes.
where there's
Yeah. Yeah.
actually
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
these businesses that are deciding like, hey,
Even
we're
small
gonna actually put
businesses, even small business owners, and one to
yeah,
50
small.
employees. Yep.
Yeah, but like this adds up. I mean,
Oh
obviously
yeah.
you
I
have the
agree.
public
I agree.
buys. You have the
Yep.
public buys, right? But as opposed to retail, it's also a little bit different because you might have there's fewer than retail for sure,
Yep.
but there's more than you would expect is what I've gathered from conversations that I've
Yep.
had.
And they can buy more
Um,
too.
yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking about these businesses, like it's not insignificant. Like if
Yeah. I
they're
agree.
putting 5, 10% of their balance
Yep.
sheet with cash, that's actually their net, like able to put in a lot more than like the
Yeah.
average retail person,
Yeah.
right? Because we're talking about a business that's making like money, that's like trying to
Yeah.
recirculate, that has like a business
Yep.
purpose for this. Um, so I think that's kind of like been a buy factor. So I'm pretty bullish on those kind of companies. I think
Yep.
like
I agree.
those companies that are embracing treasury, like understand they're really good at making cash, doing whatever they're doing,
Yep.
but they actually also acknowledge that once they've made the cash, it's not their forte to
To
like,
keep it. Yeah. Yeah.
preserve
Yeah. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
to extend on it and things like that. So
Yep.
now I think DCAing into Bitcoin is probably the best way for them not to think about it, right?
Yep.
And then and what I've heard is like, like when I mentioned to you, it's like some of these businesses, they're just literally, now, having said that, like some of these people I'm talking to, they're like people who are already like super pilled, they're really
Yep.
into it and stuff
Yep.
like that. So it's not your average mom and pop owner,
Yep.
but they're like on autopilot, but their autopilot's like,
Yep.
I just put 10% of whatever's on my balance sheet into Bitcoin. So they're
Yep.
effectively DCAing in
Yep.
on
Yep.
a quite a significant base. I mean, we could be talking about like 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, like,
Yep.
maybe even a million with some of these businesses. Like you can think of
Yep.
like a doctor's clinic, like a dentist clinic,
And
like,
there's
they're
thousands of
making
these businesses that can do that today, and that
there's
will be doing it
thousands and
over
thousands
time.
of these
Yeah. Yeah.
businesses,
Yeah.
and there's
Yeah.
also actually
Yeah.
public companies that haven't
Yep.
announced as well.
Yep.
That are, and that I think is I'm very bullish on because that's like kind of like there now. There's going to be always movement. And I think retail's not here because maybe they were shaken out a little bit by like
Yep.
previous bear cycles, and
Yep.
I think the previous bear cycles probably hit retail especially hard.
I agree. I agree. I think seeing all
stuck on.
I'd say all the Celsiuses, uh,
Yeah, the Celsiuses, the like
that was a
FTX
very big hit
holder.
for retail.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that might explain why retail hasn't necessarily gone back in strength.
Yep.
And we'll see what happens with business with these treasury owners and with these treasury companies as it goes on. I think
Yep.
there's going to be a little bit of a down cycle because the treasury companies that are treasury companies for the sake of being treasury companies, I don't know how sustainable that is.
Yep. I agree. Yep.
But I do think, I mean, one interesting thing to think about is like other than retail, if some of this hidden factor, I mean, there's also like legit institutionals like pensions funds that are
Yep.
adopting at this point.
Yep.
And the thing with those is like, unlike retail, is like they have pretty long time horizons. Like
Yep.
even at the extreme end, a pension fund basically can't liquidate anything until like 10 or 20 years in.
Years. Years.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, yeah. Maybe years, maybe decades,
Yep.
They might have a shorter term view, but traditionally, like, they're investing in a decade long
Yep.
framework at least, right?
Yep.
And even these businesses we're talking about, like they have the ability to withstand, because this is basically like retained earnings, right?
Yep.
Like they have the ability to withstand some blows. They're continually still making money.
Yep.
They're not as susceptible to retail. And also since I think a lot of them are using OTCs, or they're serviced by exchanges in a particular way,
Yep.
like they're maybe slightly more protected than
Yep.
because just even I'm just speaking about like Canada, which is where I'm based. Like in order for you to get a corporate treasury, you can only work with certain partners. So
Yep.
certain
Yep.
partners can only do corporate, and those tend to be like the largest.
Yep.
Not to say that just because you're the largest, you're not able to fail. Obviously, what we saw with FTX, but there is a little bit of a like, you know,
Insulates. Yep.
yeah, there's like a little bit of
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
insulation,
Yeah.
and you're a little bit more because if you're doing it from corporate, there's like some extra steps, and then you
Yep.
have to
Yeah.
like work with different providers, and they service you a bit better. Um, like
Yep.
namely, they assign you like an account manager or an account holder because
Yep.
usually you're buying in enough volume that it's actually
Yep.
worth their
It makes
time to
sense. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
actually. Yeah, yeah. So like unlike an individual retail person, like an individual retail person will deal with like a customer service
Yep.
agent. Like
Yep.
these businesses will likely deal with, dedicated concierge or a team.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens if there is a down cycle, because I do think the composition has shifted slightly.
Yep. All right, last question. Very simple question. What's your view? We're talking pure price action. This is your view, your personal opinion, NFA, not financial advice. In the next 6 to 12 months, what do you think Bitcoin, pure price action, what is the price of Bitcoin in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, back me in a corner here because I usually love to talk about everything except for the exact specific
And
price.
again, you can get it wrong, it's fine, but this is the question that everyone wants to know with every guest.
Yeah, I
Um,
know, I
you know,
know, I know. Yeah, I got you. I got you. Yeah, that makes sense. You know what? I think that because of what we talked about, I personally think, again, not financial advice, that we're gonna be at a healthy like 120K, 150K range for a lot
yep.
this year. I don't think this is the year it breaks out. I
Mm,
I also I also think at some point there's kind of like two things that make me think that that could be like a risk to price
yep.
action.
Yep.
I remember back in the day we used to all say, "Oh, it's all like tether printing or like whatever,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's
yeah,
what's
yeah.
keeping up
Yeah.
Bitcoin." And it feels
Yeah.
like that FUD has actually faded away now that tether
Yeah.
is like completely integrated into US politics, which is kind of
Yeah.
crazy to think about as well. Um, I think that there's two things. One is that uh, a lot of the uh, so we kind of talked a little bit about how a lot of the custody has become more and more centralized, right?
Yep.
And that's
Yeah.
that's not necessarily just because of the treasury companies, that's also because of the ETFs.
Yeah.
So a lot of the Bitcoin is being held in a way. There is a concentration where like now a ton of Bitcoin, including I believe strategies, but you can fact check me, is being held by Coinbase, right?
Yeah.
And so I think if there's like a major exchange that gets hacked, I mean, obviously we've had like a bunch of hacks.
Yep.
but I could see that being an issue. Like if Lazarus Group like hacks like the Bitcoin that's being held in ETFs, that would be like
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah,
major thing.
yeah,
I don't know how. I mean, Coinbase has had a couple of recent leaks
yeah,
and like insider employee kind of stuff.
yeah, yeah.
So you can
Definitely,
never
definitely a black swan that actually everyone. That's not. It's one of those black swan, not black swan events because it has happened in the past at to smaller exchanges. But yes, I mean it's definitely it's on the risk landscape.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And then I think the other bearish thing is kind of like what we talked about is the Bitcoin treasury companies. I mean, the flip
yeah,
side of
yeah,
them is like they are forced to sell
yeah,
if price hits a
yeah,
certain place. So they will be like a bearish
yeah,
support factor if the market goes bear. But
yeah,
bullish stuff, there's more and more adoption. I think as you're seeing with these institutions, and retail hasn't quite come back
yeah,
yet, I think.
yeah,
So I'm putting that all together. I think 120K, 150K. I do think if it goes bear, it goes very bear, and if it goes bull, it goes very bull. So
yeah.
that's like I'm
Interesting.
not, like either like my base case scenario. So like I guess what I'm saying with that is like my bear, base, and bull are very wildly different from each
Yeah,
other.
yeah,
I think that, there's a bear where like all these different things happen and we don't see that much movement, and we could see really steep descents,
yeah,
drawdowns to periods that we haven't seen before, maybe 30K, 40K, I don't know, like
yeah,
Bitcoin price. That's my personal opinion. There's a baseline scenario where I think we just kind of chug along at the usual CAGR, maybe slightly less than like Bitcoin's annualized return this year.
yeah,
And that would kind of be kind of like a base. There's like a really parabolic bull where, a number of different things start happening, right? Like maybe you have a lot of countries, you have a lot of these companies, and then retail
companies
comes
coming in.
back.
Yep, yep,
Yeah, yeah. And then, I mean, a thing that probably your viewers are tracking as well is like the available, at least I'm talking about Bitcoin supply on exchanges
yep.
is, like that could
Dropping and
get,
low and getting lower. Oh yeah, 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 yeah,
yeah, that's been dropping steadily, and that could get really low. And that's where you could start seeing like, if there's buyers that are mandated. I mean, that's kind of the one thing with the strategic reserve or whatever's happening with that. Like there's gonna be a lot of front running
yeah, yeah,
because that's going to be announced, the amount's going to be announced, and everything's like that. But once
yeah,
they commit to that, they're like committed to that, and the market's
yeah,
going to have to price that in. And if all that Bitcoin is swamped up, and still the government is mandated
yeah.
to
To buy
buy at
and
a
retail
certain,
comes back. Yeah,
and retail comes back, then
yeah,
you will see, that's where I think, I'm not gonna say it myself, but you've had people like Samson who've, I think, have done the math or whatever and have come out with like a million or 1.5
yeah,
million. Like
yeah.
I
I
don't
saw
know
that one.
exactly the
Yeah, yeah,
number, but the basic point is that like once that liquid supply is
yeah,
not available, right? Like a lot of really weird things can happen with price discovery,
yeah,
and
yeah,
so I think that can be like a really bullish factor.
yeah.
So yeah, that's me.
Well, we'll check back in a few months with this. We'll definitely have you back on the show. This flew by, so definitely a lot of stories to. I think we'll do a recap of what we discussed and also get more into. I think the audience loves to hear like the Chinese stories and the Western stories, big and the difference. So thank you for being on the show. We'll post all the links, including your book and anything you want around the replay. Thank you for joining us on the CoinRock Show, everyone, and we will talk to you next time.
All right, thanks a lot, Mateus. This was an
Thank you.
honor. It was great to be on here.
Thank you. Hey, thanks for watching. If you got value from this episode, you're going to love what's coming next. So subscribe now. We drop new episodes and videos several times a week featuring power players, market movers, and insiders from the financial world. And if you want access to deals and insights we only share privately, hit the links in the description and we'll see you on the next show.